All right, guys, what is up? Welcome in another episode of GC Live. You get dual GC Lives today because Chris and I will be at camp tomorrow for South Carolina high schools at South Carolina, and basically did not want to go another week without having a show. So some of you may have just tuned in to Jack's show a moment ago, Jack and Kendall, but Chris and I hopping on here as well to give our reaction to the hire of Kevin Schnall, and then also, of course, talk a little bit of Gamecock football and continue our breakdown of the various position groups for the Gamecocks too. What's up, Craig? Hope you're doing well. Hope everybody else out there is well too. And as always, this show brought to you by our guy Clint Hammond of CMG Home Loans, ClintHammond.com, 803-422-6797, NMLS number 71597. And as we always tell you, you may not be in the market for a home right now, but when you are, or if you're looking to kind of take that big step in the future, all we ask is that you give our guy Clint an opportunity to earn your business. 803-422-6797. That is his personal number. You can call it, you can text it, and what he'll probably want to do is set up a more formal conversation with you where you can just go through what your many options might be towards home ownership in terms of interest rates that are available, different mechanisms that could help you take that step, and of course wanting to know and just give a detailed personal approach to how much you would be paying upfront and per month with that mortgage. So again, hit up our guy Clint Hammond of CMG Home Loans.
And we're also going to take a minute to tell you about our friends at Ferry Chevrolet. That's F-A-I-R-E-Y Chevrolet, ferrychevrolet.com. That's where you need to go if you're thinking about maybe getting into the market for a new or used Chevrolet vehicle. If you're thinking about trading in, ferrychevrolet.com, or you can give them a call at 803-937-4531. If you go online, you can check out their inventory, new and used vehicles, their financing options. They've been around for 100 years, since 1926, right here in the great state of South Carolina, still led by a local fourth-generation dealer in Joseph Ferry, located in Orangeburg, so convenient to Columbia or Charleston and worth the trip. But if you want to get started right now, check them out at ferrychevrolet.com. Appreciate their support. And just like Clint, with mortgages, if you are in the market for a new or used vehicle, always ask, give Joseph Ferry and his team an opportunity to earn your business, ferrychevrolet.com.
Yeah, of course, I want to thank both of those great sponsors, and thank you for joining us here on this episode of GC Live. Chris and I don't typically talk a ton of baseball, but obviously that has been the topic that has, I would say, captured, for the most part, everybody's attention over the last few weeks as South Carolina kicked their search into overdrive. And then, of course, with the news coming out on Tuesday morning that Schnall is going to be the hire, and now the Gamecocks making that official with the Board of Trustees approving a new contract for him at a little bit past 4 o'clock on Thursday or Wednesday afternoon. Now we move ahead, Chris. Today is Thursday. Friday, we will have the official introduction to Kevin Schnall Friday night. Big welcome party, food, drinks, fireworks, press conference, all the above. And ultimately, the Gamecocks end up with the guy that I think was kind of – this thing did have some twists, some turns, some of that real, some of that just based on, I would say, the getting more information coming out. Like I do think Scott Forbes was like probably in the mix, probably from the very beginning. Maybe the information on whether he was a real candidate or not shifted at various times. Obviously, you kind of had there's a couple of days where social media was just going crazy that Schnall was able to, or was gonna, already had the job, even though he didn't have the offer yet. So I think that brought a little bit of, intrigue to it, a little bit of drama to it, when really behind the scenes, it was kind of a fairly straightforward but in-depth search from Jeremiah Donati, Tyson Lusk, his entire staff over there, and the Gamecocks ultimately get their guy who, I would say is probably one of the first few names that popped up when all this started with South Carolina is definitely going to talk to Kevin Schnall. And as of last night, he is the brand new South Carolina baseball coach.
Yeah, I think you made a great point on the radio show earlier today on the game, Wes, and that is this process seemed longer than it was because of when Paul Mainieri and South Carolina parted ways, not just during the season, but actually fairly early in the season. Kevin Schnall's name immediately was floated for this job, and that made sense, right? He is a candidate who's in Conway, in state, has been in the state of South Carolina for 25 years, has found success, including in his first year as head coach for Coastal Carolina, taking them to Omaha, finishing as the national runner-up. He was a name that made sense. He was a name that you figured would probably be interested in the job. But there were a few different layers to this thing. Number one, Monty Lee was taking over the program, and it was only fair that South Carolina was going to give him an opportunity to put his stamp on this program and see how that went, to see if he was going to be a viable candidate. Of course, as the season progressed, and certainly when we got to the end, we knew the answer to that even before it was said, that this was going to be an outside hire, which frankly was always much more likely, right? But you did have to let that play out. You had to get to the point where these coaches and the representatives could actually talk a little bit more. South Carolina wasn't able to dive in the middle of the regular season headfirst into a coaching search really in earnest. So there had to be some time for that to play out. You had coaching candidates who were playing postseason baseball, whether the conference tournament, NCAA regionals, even into the super regionals. And this was never, even though this thing did get to Kevin Schnall, who was kind of the odds-on favorite from the start, it was not a let's talk to some guys as a token, let's kind of go through the motions, semantics. We're going to hire Kevin Schnall, but we'll talk to these other guys just to check that box. This was an actual search. There was a process. From our understanding, what we've heard is an in-depth process. And it did end up landing on Kevin Schnall, which is the guy that a lot of people thought would ultimately get this job and where you would place your bets, so to speak. But it didn't happen as early as a lot of people thought. So, Wes, one thought here, now that we're past the search, right? I think everybody's relieved that this part is over. You have a coach. So what's next, right? Coaching staff hires, player retention. Can you get some players who went in the portal that may be in South Carolina and Kevin Schnall's plans to jump out of the portal and come back to Columbia? Who will you get that has jumped in the portal from another school? And then the excitement of just having a new coach, right? I think South Carolina as a school, as an athletics department, has done well to kind of lean into the excitement that this creates. You're not just having a press conference, today at 2:30 p.m. You're having a celebration, right, at Founders Park with fireworks and inviting the fans for a free event and having a night press conference. You've got Kevin Schnall putting out a video on social media telling Gamecock fans, we need you to give us a great environment in Founders Park. So now we move on to the part that's more fun, which is trying to rebuild this program, following along with Kevin Schnall's process to do that, and getting, closer to where now people are saying, kind of get this sense from the fan base, Wes, man, I can't wait to see what happens as they build it. And I can't wait to be in Founders Park next season for first pitch to see the start of this new era.
Yeah, I want to get in at least a little bit to what South Carolina is getting in Kevin Schnall in terms of his approach to the game. But to your point, man, a lot of people are wanting to know, A, who's the staff going to be? What does the rest of it look like? And B, who can South Carolina go out and get from the transfer portal? And I think it's going to be interesting. We already know that Matt Williams is coming on as the pitching coach. We already know that there's a bunch of guys from Coastal that are coming over in what I guess the easiest way to call it, what we would traditionally have called in like football, like kind of the off the field roles, support staff, not one of your kind of just traditional true on field coaches, even though we know in college ball that line has been very, very much blurred the last few years with changes to the rules. But just in terms of like your big money, like your titled coaches right now, we know Matt Williams is coming on as pitching coach. We'll see what happens with some of those other guys. A couple of guys you would imagine probably end up staying at Coastal maybe in some role because they've been kind of Coastal lifers, but we shall see. I continue to hear two things, Chris, and I don't really know which one. Maybe it's both, and I don't know which one's going to quite win out, but the possibility of Schnall trying to add a guy or two who either has SC ties or SEC ties in terms of like you've done it at a very high level at Coastal, and we know Matt Williams has had the 1 year at South Carolina as well. But just maybe somebody on this assistant coaching staff that has a little bit more experience in terms of like what do you have to win in this league. And of course, when you're talking about SC ties like South Carolina, you're talking about what has been successful for this program when it has been successful as a blue blood. And I think that part will be pretty entertaining for fans to find out what that looks like, particularly if they can maybe snag a big name or two to fill out this staff. We shall see. But beyond that, of course, in 2026, one of the first things everybody always asks, hey, what's the portal looking like? Who are you going to bring in? And as you see right now, this would be as of 2:14 p.m. on Thursday when we're going live and recording this, 7 South Carolina commitments out of the portal, and no shock, all 7 from Coastal Carolina. And Chris, this is something you and I talked about quite a bit on the radio. I don't know if we've had a chance to dive into it here on the pod, but the fact that everybody else, for the most part, when they hire a new coach, they benefit from what we're seeing right here. Like, this is just a part of the game now. If I have guys at my previous stop that I think can play at the level of my new job, some of them follow the coach. That just, it is what it is. And among, let's call it what it is, among several early errors, I think, for the Pulmonary era was the fact that he hadn't been coaching for a few years. So you weren't talking about being able to just bring in some foundational guys to start to fill out the roster. How different would Ashley Chastain Woodard's first year have been in softball if she wasn't able to bring in all those ladies that understood exactly what she wanted from her program coming in from Charlotte, but still a lot of them made smooth transitions to the hardest level of softball. If you're South Carolina, you're hoping several of these baseball players can do the same. And I think, Chris, you got a nice little mix here. Some of these guys have played a bunch at Coastal, like a Walker Mitchell, who was their starting third baseman. Luke Jones was one of their starting pitchers. Hayden Johnson, who was coming off of an injury, but apparently has like Friday night, Saturday night type stuff, if he can get all that back. And then Chris, Jackson Weiner, who is someone that was pointed out to me, he was only a freshman this year, was still getting his feet under him. Also was coming, he's a two-way guy, was also coming off of an injury, so wasn't pitching, but was still hitting some, and just has what you would call light tower power, like huge exit velocities, natural power, natural pop off the bat. So you're starting to get some guys you can work with. Now the next step is, all right, are there any other Coastal guys that will trickle into this roster? Who from South Carolina will be back? Will Craddock is the one that stands out the most to me. Like, that'd be nice for them to get back a young kid who is, I would say, a surefire starter if you can get him back. And then perhaps the most exciting, when do we start getting some names of outsiders, if you will, non-South Carolina, non-Coastal Carolina targets who may come check out what the new Gamecock baseball program is all about?
Yeah, and those are the, I think there's excitement in bringing in some Coastal guys for the exact reason that you laid out, right? It's bringing in guys that are already familiar with what Schnall is going to do. In some cases, those guys are guys that have started to prove themselves or have proven themselves. Walker Mitchell, son of former late Gamecock quarterback Alan Mitchell, of course, certainly fits that mold. If you go and look at what his metrics and what he's done throughout his career, what he did last season as a starter, that really stands out. But, there is some excitement in bringing in new faces from guys transferring up a level who tore it up at their previous school, or even pulling a transfer from another SEC program who's looking for a better fit. The key is exactly that, though, right? It's fit. And I think that's, you look at everything that's happened with the baseball program the past couple years, and there's not, as is often the case or always the case with things that don't work, there's more than one reason for it, right? But this has not been a resource problem for South Carolina. It's been how they've deployed the resources for recruiting. Sometimes, frankly, they haven't taken the right guys. Sometimes they've taken guys and they weren't developed, right? Sometimes there's been injuries that have, and a combination of all those different things in some cases. So for Kevin Schnall, and he talked about this a little bit, I think in the Gamecocks Plus feature, everybody should go check that out. If you're a Gamecock Club member, you get access to that. Make sure you sign up. He did a quick interview with Derek Scott that I checked out. And one of the things he talked about was not only getting kids with power and kids who can reach base and speed on the bases, but finding guys who have passion and energy for the game, fit, right? If you want to just use a general term for that, that's something he's going to be looking for. The interesting thing in these coastal guys so far, Wes, is it hits two different buckets. One is what you mentioned in being a gap with Paul Maneri, in that he didn't have guys that he could say, hey, I was just at school A, I can bring these guys with me. You're kind of starting from scratch from a roster standpoint, trying to bring in guys that you don't really know until you get your hands on them with the portal. These guys, Kevin Schnall, Matt Williams, the rest of, other staff members, if they end up coming, they're going to know what they're getting in the upside with these guys. The other part is, out of these 7 guys as of right now, 6 of them are from the state of South Carolina in terms of high school ball. And even Bryce Eastep, who I think is from Kentucky, played his senior season at P27 Academy. So that's another thing that you see with this group. There's been so much talk on focusing on high school recruiting in the state. You can go look, it's fallen off as of late. South Carolina needed somebody who could come in and make sure that they blanket the state, bring in more talent from the state. Schnall's done that at Coastal, and it appears to be part of his plan in recruiting, because he's talked about it already a bit in terms of bringing in homegrown talent from the state of South Carolina.
Yeah, and I don't know, Chris, especially the way baseball recruiting is. It's not – you do see some flips these days. I think at one point it used to be you just didn't really see flips in baseball. But it's nothing like what you and I cover in football recruiting, where, if a new coach were to come in, it's like, all right, who are they going to flip? They're going to flip somebody. And so I think long-term, the high school bucket of players, of talent in state, branching out into the state of Georgia as well. It has a ton of great baseball players. Into Florida, we've seen South Carolina have success in those states. I think that's going to be a huge part of it. Wouldn't necessarily be a huge part of it right now going into next year. Just a guess, I would say probably not. But I also, and I'm saying this broadly, not like I know anything at all, but it wouldn't be a bad thing at all if you're Kevin Schnall, if you're the staff, if there's a guy or two, like a late bloomer in the state of South Carolina that you're going, hey, I think that guy could help. To me, it would just be a nice early omen, a nice early statement to go out and add a couple of guys in the high school ranks from South Carolina to sort of go ahead and show, like, hey, this is not going to be all portal all the time, which is essentially what South Carolina fans have watched for the most part, for the last 2 cycles, other than Monty Lee doing his absolute best against all other odds to try and hold the thing together and still recruit some high school guys. So, and I say that to segue us in, as Craig said, congrats to Monty Lee, joins Holbrook at College of Charleston, the place he went to school, the place he played ball, and that he was the head coach of at one point. Those 2 will be tough on the recruiting trail, man. Like, if you let kids slip through your fingers, if you're South Carolina, Monty Lee and Chad Holbrook will be absolutely formidable in recruiting this state because of all the years of ties and relationships they have. But South Carolina, as we know, man, let's be honest, they're going to have resources. They're going to have resources ready to spend and deploy. And, it will be very interesting to see what Schnall can do with some more money at hand. Like that's just, it is what it is. That's the game now. So we shall see. I'm very curious, Chris, and we'll probably hear a little bit about it in the press conference on Friday. I have not watched the whole Gamecock Plus interview yet. Was there any talk about Schnall Ball just in terms of his approach to winning? I've picked up a few little details on that. I posted them actually a couple of weeks ago when I was going over some of the various candidates. But did he talk any about his game plan for like actual in game and stuff like that?
Yeah, the main things that I have seen is that, Schnall, or heard from Schnall early, and you're right, I think he'll expand on this a great deal, and you can loop back with some of the notes you've heard just from talking to people. I think I said it earlier, he's looking not just for guys that have power, right? One of the things that we heard from Paul Maneri is, and he kind of said it early this season before things really went off the rails, I thought we'd hit more home runs this season, right? The SEC, as we know, is a power league. You got power arms, you got power bats. That is part of the approach for Kevin Schnall, and maybe even more of his approach here in this league than it was at Coastal. We will see, and we'll get his thoughts on that. But also, he likes to be active on the base pass. He'll bunt, he'll he said that he wanted not just guys who can hit for power, but a guy who is, I think the quote was, obsessed with getting to first base, right? So we know from what we've heard and observed from him that he's very analytics oriented, very detail oriented. I don't think that means every single decision is driven by necessarily a piece of data, right? At some point, you got to get up there, get a hit, got to get up there, make a pitch. But it seems like he kind of takes a multifaceted approach. It's not just, hey, let's go up there and hope we hit a home run. It seems like very much there's a lot of different moving pieces to what he wants his offensive philosophy to be.
Yeah, and I mean, you hear the words detail oriented quite a bit, with some coaches, but that continues to come up, just almost like obsessively detail oriented. And was also told, man, he's a guy who just remembers everything. Like, I don't want to put him in the Steve Spurrier category in terms of that, but he is definitely someone who like can sit there and recall, a specific at bat, a specific pitch, a specific situation from a long time ago, and then use that moving forward in terms of his decision making. So I think that is an interesting note. It will be. I'm very curious to see how do we see the approach shift as he is able to get more talent, particularly with his position players, because the thing that doesn't quite, I guess, compute for me, he has a huge analytics team, very analytics driven, but also he is really, the whole Schnall Ball thing is obviously a play on the words of small ball, and it's not just because it sounds cool. Like they will bunt runners over. They will try to put guys in motion. If you watch any Major League Baseball, the analytics-driven teams, nobody is out there bunting. So the analytics actually push you far away from the idea of giving away outs. Now, on base percentage, which is what he's talking about with, I will give my left limb to get on first base, those type of guys, I feel like that's numbers driven. But bunting is not. So I do wonder, and I think from what I've heard, you're talking about a sharp enough guy that he's not going to be married to anything, but he's not, if he has a team that can't necessarily generate a lot of power and can't necessarily create a lot of runs by just going up there and hitting, he is going to be willing to say, hey, we're going to do everything we can to manufacture. And I do think in a weird way, man, you actually have had so many people go away from bunting. We're even seeing this at the major league level with some teams. People don't have to defend it anymore. So if you're willing to bunt, if you're willing to put the ball on the turf and make them make a play, particularly in pressure situations, and particularly, I think, Chris, look at the number of midweek games South Carolina lost this year. Those are the games where, how many times in just history have you seen a midweek team, David versus Goliath, have an opportunity to beat South Carolina, but then they make a mistake, they make an error, they let Carolina get a little bit of momentum, and then South Carolina takes advantage, comes back because they have better players, and wins the game. So I do think there's probably some value for someone who gets into a game, says, hey, we're just kind of not hitting the ball today. Let's try to make something happen. And, I think that's something to keep an eye on. How does his philosophy maybe morph, maybe shift, maybe evolve, however you want to say it, from game 1 to game 52 and everything in between?
And I think, we don't have an answer. We have an answer. Who's the head coach? Who's the pitching coach? Those guys will be on the same page. We don't know yet who's going to be the quote-unquote hitting coach for Kevin Schnall in Columbia. You would think that whoever he decides to bring, whether a current staffer, whether an outside hire, somebody that's familiar with familiar with the SEC, like you said earlier, Wes, is going to be on the same page with Kevin Schnall. Something we talked about a lot last season when you had Monty Lee, who had one hitting philosophy. You had Paul Maneri, who kind of had final say, seemed to have a different philosophy. I feel pretty confident that whoever Kevin Schnall brings on, whoever ends up getting this job to be the hitting coach, there's going to be a synergy in the philosophies, right? And it may be that Kevin Schnall says, hey, I'm going to the SEC. We're going to have to hit for a little bit more power maybe than we have in the past, because that's what this league's all about. So you would anticipate his hire might kind of mirror whatever philosophy he wants to take on here. I think you're right. He's not going to be specifically married in every situation, in every game, to a certain philosophy. So that's one of the things I'm very interested to hear more on in terms of his philosophy, and just to see, right, once we actually get into the games.
Yep, no doubt, man. All right, hey, we promised we would talk a little recruiting, and we've got to continue our positional breakdowns as well. But first, Chris, you want to tell everybody about another of our great sponsors?
Tell everybody about ATSCO. That's ATSKO.com. And if you're an outdoorsman or outdoors woman, definitely recommend you check out our friends Lee Wiles and ATSCO. He's running the show over there. Hunting, outdoor equipment, outdoor products, waterproofing like footwear, clothing, outdoor gear, zero brand UV control, odor control, even special laundry detergents for hunters out there, even products, pet care for the pets in your house. Go check them out. ATSCO.com, ATSKO.com. They've been around for a long time. If you're planning a trip, a hike, if you're a fisher, if you're a hunter, must check out. Tons of people trust their products. ATSCO.com. That's ATSKO.com.
Appreciate those guys being a sponsor. And all right, Chris, let's talk football recruiting. Call it what it is. Not a fun week for Gamecock fans. Not a fun week and a half for Gamecock fans. And something you and I have posted that just has started to, I think, take on a little bit of a life of its own with this class so far is that as the official visit season has started, and as these players have visited other schools, for one, I think there's a national trend of certain schools just being incredibly aggressive from an NIL standpoint when they get prospects on their campus. We all know about like Texas Tech and their approach the last couple of off seasons, but I would throw Miami in there, Auburn, Texas A&M, maybe Texas to an extent, like some schools that are just refusing to be denied on high school recruiting and maybe aren't even worried about tomorrow. They're just worried about today. Like let's just do what we got to do to get these guys into the into our class and go from there, man. So I think that's a factor. But what you're also seeing is that schools are absolutely hammering South Carolina on 4-8, and they're trying to drum up the basically job security conversation. And I think even though the NIL stuff matters probably as much as anything these days, that is still a factor. And, it has been tough for South Carolina to overcome, I think, with some of these kids. But I also think let's see what happens when this season starts. Because Chris, I think there's a lot of quiet confidence in Columbia around this team. I don't know if you've sensed that yet, but I've just sensed a feeling that this is a team that can overachieve from expectations. And then if you can do that, you start to get those guys back on your campus. You bring them in, let them check out your atmosphere, and then you do what we've seen South Carolina do late with some in-state guys the last couple cycles, and you try to make the big push and make the flip leading into signing day.
Yeah, I think those things that you laid out are definitely at play. And I would add in one more too, Wes. I think and it's difficult for fans to watch as guys who have offers or who have visited South Carolina commit to other programs. And I think there's a few buckets here, and two of them, at least, you mentioned there. There's another one in that in some instances, South Carolina, of course, has an internal pecking order like any school. There have been some cases where you see a guy, that guy visited South Carolina, took an OV, he's had an offer for a while. I know who that guy is because I'm reading Gamecock Central or the Big Spur, and that guy commits somewhere else. In some of those instances, certainly not all. Sometimes you just get beat, right? Some of them are situations where South Carolina said, we're not matching that offer, right? Their internal value on a guy was not as high as what another school valued that prospect at. And so I think all those things are happening all at once. And so what is the fix? Well, I think the biggest one is just what you said for South Carolina. Get into the season, win some games, right? Because if you don't have success on the field, Wes, even if they had amassed this really nice offer commitment list, the opposite would happen. Other schools are coming to poach your commitments. We've already seen some of that. You would see it if South Carolina struggles again on the field this year if they had 15 commitments right now. You got to go win some games, show progress on the field, show that, the goal is to show that, we went 4-8 last year, but the year before we were nearly in the playoff. This year, for example, if you have success, hey, we're sitting here, middle of the season, we're 5-1, we're 6-0. Like, that's what you want, because then it shows stabilization. It shows that last season was maybe more of a blip on the radar. That's the goal. And I think there's some guys that have committed elsewhere, maybe a handful of them, that I think you would have an opportunity to get back in on, right? Recruiting's volatile nowadays. It's always been pretty volatile, probably even more so now. And that's what you need. That's kind of the bottom line. There's a lot of reasons for what we've seen. You can kind of trace most of it back to last season, and that being really hammered against South Carolina on the recruiting trail.
Austin with a question. Do you think perception of Barnes can mirror Travian's if the team has success, obviously, where the recruits come a year or two in after we see development from his position? Yeah, I think that's valid, but I think also, man, he's had interest from these guys. Like a lot of people, and not just us here locally, the national guys really thought South Carolina had a slight edge on Fred Ards. And a lot of that is, relationship building. It is, some of it is, yes, South Carolina. Like, I think when we say South Carolina is prioritizing a guy, let's call it what it is. That means they're putting their resources behind a player, and they're out there. They're going to spend like a lot of these other SEC schools if they see a player on their board or if they think a player on their board is worth spending that. So some of these edge guys, they're in on. I don't know necessarily if it's because Barnes hasn't been here long that they've missed. I think some of them, if you just look individually, like Ards, the fact that A&M was in the playoff last year and South Carolina won 4 games, like that has been specifically mentioned to us as an issue there. But also, Chris, I think Fred Ards is our perfect example because we've heard that, we've heard that brought up. But also, I think he's a guy, if Carolina win some games this year, we're going to be asking around. We're going to be tracking this kid. Hey, do we need to keep an eye on him for signing day? Like, I think he's someone we will continue to track moving forward. And, I think Carolina they have played the long game on guys under Shane Beamer, and it has worked out to this point. So I think there's a lot of guys that you're looking at playing the long game with and trying to just see if you can land them when it gets to the end. Let's I guess briefly go into this weekend, Chris. Chris Whitehead, yet another edge that Carolina has been firmly in the mix with, highly recruited guy. I think he's going to be tough to land, to be just completely frank, completely honest. But at this point, Carolina have a great story to sell because there's not another highly recruited edge in this class. So you can kind of put a lot of your marbles into him and say, hey, come in and be our high school edge in this class. Come be the man. He is ranked the number 8 edge in the country. Lots of Virginia Tech buzz here as of late, man. And Virginia Tech, I feel like worth mentioning. Those guys have kind of they've re-energized some of their big boosters. And, we saw the big, $75 million donation that will partially go to academics. Partially maybe doing some heavy lifting, if I had to guess on this one, Chris. So
I would think so.
I think with Whitehead, this is a perfect example. This to me is a trend you see in football. New coach, an in-state kid who is highly rated. Major schools are after him. Ohio State firmly after him too. And the in-state school says, man, this will be a statement to keep that guy. Let's do everything in our power to keep him here.
Yep. So you could expect a heavy potential investment for Virginia Tech. So that begs the question of, how much does that matter in this recruitment? And I think we'll find out more after this weekend, get some feedback on the visit, see how that goes. But he's a guy that's been maybe a little bit more quietly on the radar, Wes, but has had this visit booked for quite a while. He's also got a brother, offensive lineman, who South Carolina is recruiting in the 2028 class. So definitely one to watch and see where it goes. But, that I have a feeling, you mentioned Ard's not coming in this weekend. He's already visited, committed to A&M. I think he'll be one we'll continue to track, but Whitehead is obviously one as well.
What's your vibe on Amari Patterson? I'm going to put you on the spot on that one because I wrote about him yesterday and I was like, I don't really know what to say on this one because
I have a good feel. Yeah, it's been up and down, right? I mean, he, South Carolina offered late. LSU, Georgia, Florida have all been involved. At one point, it looked like he would go to Florida. But the question was always, okay, will he end up using an OV for South Carolina? And he did that, right? And in fact, canceled a trip. Now he's going to South Carolina this weekend. Another kind of wait and see. I don't think this is one where you go into it saying, all right, South Carolina is definitely making their move this weekend. It's kind of trending that way. I don't think we know enough yet to say that. I think there's a lot of conversations that have to be had. But we know Carolina wants to be picky with their third receiver take in this class. They've got 2 committed, but he fits the bill as someone that they would potentially take. So Gamecocks, offered late, like I said, kind of a wait and see. Will he schedule a visit? That step has now been taken, which is another positive step. Now we have to see what happens this weekend with the feedback.
Well, and a couple of other layers there, man. Georgia Tech got him in for a midweek. What does that mean? Colorado reportedly potentially getting involved here late. Like, I don't think that's one where you can box yourself into making any predictions. I think you got to kind of just wait and see what happens there. And I don't know. Let's see what the feedback is, as you said. But a couple other guys coming in this weekend. And then, Chris, I think we have constantly been on watching other guys go to other places and what does it mean for South Carolina? You know what I'm saying? Like, I think if you look at the list of players that are expected on South Carolina's campus next weekend, so the 19th, that's one that's been circled for a long time. Now, some of the guys originally that were going to visit that weekend have already committed elsewhere, so those visits don't take place. But, if you can hold off, you've got Josh Dobson scheduled to come in. If you can hold off, you've had Trey Segura on the list for that week. LSU made a huge push with him this past weekend. That's not just a rumor. That's pretty much confirmed multiple places, but hasn't committed anywhere yet. So can you continue to trend to get him on your campus? Nate Carson's supposed to be on your campus on June 19th. He's one, Chris. And I've interviewed Nate a couple times. Great kid, fun to talk to. Appears to be about all the right things. But also I feel like with Nate, wherever he's been at lately, he has a phenomenal time, right? Like there's always that kind of buzz about his most recent visit. It was Clemson 2 weekends ago. Then, it was Georgia. So what does that look like for him? I think that's one where you're going, if you're Carolina, hey, just get to the visit. We'll have our last shot. And, you maybe feel fairly good about that if you're the Gamecocks. So I think for several of these highly recruited in-state guys, I just look at it, can they hold on until they get them to Columbia for that final weekend?
Yep. Can they hold on? Or if they do happen to commit somewhere else, there's a few guys you can think of, hey, you're going to keep recruiting them unless they say you can't recruit me anymore. And then you get to the season and have to rely on having a good season to give you some proof there, right? Proof of concept. So a lot of long-standing relationships there. I know it's been tough for fans to watch guys kind of fly off the board or look like guys are leaning elsewhere that you thought you were in the game and have been in the game with. But it's about getting to that visit weekend, trying to close out a few more guys, and also, frankly, some that have gone elsewhere or maybe will go elsewhere, trying to stay on them and get to the season, stay on them, and see if you can have some flips later in the process.
Yeah, for sure. All right, hey, let's go to, as we tease, South Carolina Edge Room. Chris, we didn't get to see Dylan Stewart all spring long. Reports are good for him, that he'll be back, that he'll be healthy, that he'll be 100%. And, Big Rooster says Carson ain't coming here. I don't know, man. I'm not saying you're wrong, because, Chris, I also think we got to all change how we even cover or talk about this stuff, because recruiting now is like, it is a roller coaster, and it is so, and I'm not talking about Nate in particular, I'm talking about just in general. One, like you said earlier, if a guy has an offer from 10 schools and that's all you know nothing. Which of the schools really want him? Which of the schools have him top of the board? I'm going to spend my money on this guy is the real question. And which guys are backup plans, but that school is willing to pay for them if it gets to them? And which guys are they kind of just recruiting, but they really aren't going to end up pushing for it, So all that stuff just, it just is so, it's so, sorry, I was reading a comment. Fluid. Like all of it is fluid. So,
hard to speak definitively.
Yeah.
In a lot of instances.
Austin says, any validity to Seth Tillman canceling his visit to Clemson? Don't know about that, Austin. I know there was a poster on our board said something like about that. Chris, have you heard anything?
I checked on it, and I know it's going around. Checked on it. Apparently on the Clemson end, they're still expecting him to come in. That's as much as I can say, or as much as I know right now, at 2:48 on Thursday.
Gotcha.
So.
All right, Edge Room. What I was saying was no Dylan during the spring. That gave a lot of these other guys opportunities to get out there and get a lot of snaps. get a lot of reps. And dude, my surprise for pretty much the entire spring in that room, and I would say even maybe one of my top 5 or so surprises on the team, and would have been Anthony Addison. Like I think we heard some buzz about Anthony Addison last year. It was a little bit more of like, all right, can this guy help you in a pass rush role? What would his role look like as a freshman? Didn't really play a ton, got in late in some ball games, kept his red shirt, but I think was really one of South Carolina's more improved players. Is someone that you just constantly hear about the motor, the want to get better, the want to make plays in the backfield. And, I think is someone that if you're just talking about young guys who aren't true freshmen, have like been here a year or two and seem to just kind of take a jump in the pecking order, Anthony Addison is one of the people that just stands out to me in that kind of line of thinking.
Yeah, he's got that relentless type motor, and when he came into South Carolina as a freshman, undersized, he's never going to be, a 6'6", 260-pound defensive end. That's not what he is. But can he play, Wes, a similar role to what Brian Thomas Jr. ended up being for South Carolina, which was a guy who was a relentless pass rusher who, was maybe undersized from like a length standpoint, but was just relentless and had a motor and had an attitude. And that's maybe what Addison could be. And he could be that this season. He has caused some fits in the spring. You heard a lot of really good things about him to the point where, it was almost surprising, right? Just how much positive praise we heard about him living in the backfield throughout spring. So when you look at this roster, that's kind of the question, right? Who's going to be that guy or the guys opposite Dylan? And so, there's Caleb Herring's a guy to keep an eye on as a transfer. You got Julian Walker coming in who has an opportunity to factor in as a true freshman. He certainly looks the part, but Anthony Addison is one that the fans and we, even as media, probably aren't talking about quite enough at this point.
Yeah, well, we certainly weren't, I think, to start the spring. And then you just heard more and more, about him as it went along. And just as a guy, as was described to us, he's the guy you see 30 yards downfield chasing down a running back to prevent a touchdown. And I think you need some guys like that, man. So what does that room look like? Caleb Herring, it sounds like, kind of had a good finish to the spring, going into the summer, has had a good start to the summer, it sounds like. And, is obviously going to be a factor. The other guys, here's the way I am on the edge room, man. As long as Dylan, is back 100% and can stay healthy, if Dylan is out there and those other guys are kind of working off of Dylan, like on the field opposite of Dylan, and I'm not saying he has to play every snap, but let's be honest, it is just a different group when you have Dylan Stewart on the field. So keeping him healthy, keeping him on the field in key situations is my single biggest key for that room. Like, I think you look at the interior D-line room, I feel much better about, like, just almost some interchangeable parts there. Not necessarily in skill set. Like, I think there's some different players there, but just in terms of, like, hey, if a couple of guys got injured, other guys would probably just step in there and go play close to as well. Whereas Dylan is the guy that's going to make this edge group go. And if he's out there, I think you're going to be good enough. You're going to be deep enough with those other guys. If it gets put on some of these other guys' shoulders to go, like, carry some of that load, that's where I think you do at least have a few questions about what you're able to do in terms of pass rush when you're facing really good offensive lines.
Yeah, you think back to 2024, right? You had Dylan as a freshman. You had Kyle Kennard, who ended up, winning the Nagurski Award. But you also had a really good interior defensive line with depth and talent. And all those guys were good enough individually, but together, right? That's why they were so productive and were able to wreak so much havoc at times. This year, if you have a healthy Dylan, if you have, a lot of people around the program think the D tackle room is the deepest on the roster. There's a good argument for that, on the surface. What's your, who's the starter opposite Dylan, and then who's kind of that second or that third and fourth guy? you can kind of see where the play of those others could elevate whoever that co-starter is or whoever the third, fourth guy is, and vice versa. Having another quality option on one side at edge is going to help Dylan Stewart. It's going to help the interior defensive line and all those things together. So another one, Wes, because there's some younger guys, Quay Dodd, Cobby is another one to watch. We mentioned Anthony Addison, but also, George Wilson. The staff was excited about him going into last year as a potential pass rush option. Then he goes down preseason with an injury, doesn't get to play. Could he factor into this thing? He's a guy that's got collegiate experience. He's got twitch. He can factor in as a pass rusher. He's another one that because he didn't play last year, maybe not being talked about quite as much.
Yeah, and I think especially if he's back 100%, to me was someone – I never quite looked at him like, hey, it's going to be an every down defensive end edge guy, but there was a lot of buzz about just his pass rush juice last year. That was a guy I think they missed being able to kind of rotate in there in situational ball. Hey, if it comes down to it, do we see South Carolina get creative? Do we see Clayton White go back into his bag of tricks and pull out the old 3-3-5, which puts – a lot of times in a 3-3-5, you're putting what are your sort of interior defensive linemen on the outside some. Like, do we see that to sort of build the depth in that room to build, like if you start to have guys where, you're a little bit banged up and you're looking for something different to throw at offenses, that's still in the bag of tricks, I think. They got away from that a little bit over the last couple of years because they haven't needed it, but Clayton White is someone who has proved to us time and time again he will adjust to what is needed on the field in order to give his defense the best chance, right? And I think you look at that room, man, you look at those defensive linemen, the interior guys, there are some players there that can go out on the edge and play and help you. Do you look at getting one of those guys on the field and using Dylan a little bit more in like a stand-up role too, to just maybe give him a little bit of that extra angle, I guess you would say, off the edge. Like I think there's a lot you can do there. Not we'll have a full breakdown of the D-line room itself in like a separate show, but I think that room certainly does take a little bit of pressure off of your edge guys, especially when you start talking about your dudes in there that are kind of more twitchy, kind of more pass rushy, and getting all those guys on the field at the same time in some like passing situations.
Yeah, Kelby Collins, I think is given his experience, he came out of high school, actually ranked as an edge. The schemes that he's played in at the past at Bama and Florida, he has some versatility. Definitely a D tackle, definitely in that room for South Carolina. But if you're thinking about deploying some different packages, he's someone that I think has some positional flexibility to do that. So you're right. Interesting to see, what they come up with. We've seen the past, few seasons, Clayton White has made some adjustments every offseason to how they're playing defensively up front. What will it be this year? I think is still a question. I think they'd like to major in 4-down linemen, but as you get into the season and play these games out, we'll see how that plays out.
Any other edge thoughts, man?
I think that's it for me, man.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's other guys. I mean, obviously going back to Julian, like that's someone bigger than your typical freshman, more advanced than your typical freshman, more just physically developed than your typical freshman. He can help that group, I think, quite a bit. But I think what you don't want to do is have to put too much on him too early. So in an ideal world, you got a healthy Dylan, you got Caleb Herring, kind of they're rolling out there first. They're your starters. They have experience. They know about life in the SEC. And then, Chris, you have Anthony Addison and Julian Walker maybe as your next guys up. And then you have George Wilson as someone who can factor in and mix in there a little bit. Austin bringing up Drew Collins, kind of quiet on his front. I think there's going to be a little bit of a adjustment period there. coming into the SEC, maybe a little bit more of a long-term player, in my opinion. But we'll see. I mean, I won't count Drew out yet. That's someone that I think we're going to have to see. What do we hear out of him in preseason camp? Was a little bit quiet there in the spring, but I think wasn't he one of the guys that was banged up a little bit too, Chris? Like,
yeah, he was a little bit banged up at times as well, but still has time. Still a young player. Don't expect too much this year. If you get it, that's certainly a bonus. But probably someone who's more of a longer term play, at least what we know right now.
Yeah, has eligibility left. So, all right, y'all. Hey, appreciate it. Baseball, football recruiting, football. We're going to get out of here. If you're joining us late, go back, rewind, check the beginning of the show. But he is Chris. I am Wes. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back on here soon on the GC Live Podcast.